Well, good morning, everybody. Wish I was with you in person, but this is the next best thing. And it's time for the annual legal update. If you have any questions as I'm talking, you can just put them in the chat or the Q&A, whatever you want. I'll check them. And what I'm going to do is, like I always do at this time of year, is talk about the new laws that just got passed and the new forms and the new form changes. Okay. So let's just get into it. I'll start with the new laws. Let me talk about big picture first. The rental situation. You probably heard that LA County extended the eviction moratorium till March 31st, which means in LA County, you still can't evict someone if they have a COVID hardship, and you can't do any no-fault evictions in LA County until the end of March, meaning the only way you can evict someone if they haven't done something wrong is to move in yourself. In other words, you can't kick them out just because you're selling the house or want to do a renovation or something like that. With certain renovations, you can do it. But all this should change April 1st, fingers crossed for landlords. It should be pretty much back to normal April 1st, as far as LA County evictions. No more local moratorium. You can kick someone out if it's a single family home or a duplex. You don't need a reason, et cetera, et cetera. So stay tuned. They keep extending it. They say that's the last time they're going to extend it. March 31st is the end of the LA County eviction moratorium. If you have specific questions on how to evict somebody, send me an email later or call the legal hotline, and I'll put my email in the chat. But that's the big picture. Now, you guys, I don't know if any of you have rental properties in the city of LA as opposed to the county of LA, because city of LA, it's still going on. I mean, there's going to be new restrictions on evictions starting in April when the LA County eviction moratorium ends. So LA City is under the LA County eviction moratorium until March 31st. Then starting April 1st in LA City, they got their own rules. If you're not in LA City, though, it should be back to normal, fingers crossed. And the other good news for landlords is, even if you were not under any rent control at all, up until tomorrow, we've all been under this COVID state of emergency. And anytime you're in a situation where your property, like all of California, is subject to a state of emergency, the anti-rent gouging laws kick in, which means there are limitations on how much you can increase someone's rent to 10%. But that's going to end tomorrow, believe it or not. So starting on, I guess, Friday, you can increase the rent as much as you want for a tenant, not in LA City, but in other places, unless you have a local rent control law. You'll be able to increase it as much as you want for single family homes, owner occupied duplexes, and any apartment building that's newer than 15 years old. If it's older than 15 years and 3 or more units, then you're limited by the Tenant Protection Act. Point being, it's very complicated. So if you're going to, number one, want to evict somebody, or number two, want to increase someone's rent by more than 10%, it's probably a good idea to call the legal hotline first, or call your own lawyer first, and we'll make sure you're using the right form and you're doing it the right way. Okay, but that's the big picture for rentals. All right, let's talk about laws. Good news on the new laws. There are not a lot of new laws you need to know about. The governor signed 997 new laws, but there's only about 10 relevant to you at all, which is good. There were a lot of bad laws that were proposed that didn't get passed. Like there was a law that was going to say, if you sold your house within 3 years after buying it at a profit, you have to pay 25% tax on the profit. Didn't pass. There was a law that said if you had a tenant occupied property, you have to offer it to the tenant first, and you can't sell it to someone else until the tenant makes up their mind. Didn't pass. There were new laws on rental properties. Anytime you have a vacancy, you have to have an energy efficiency audit. Didn't pass. There was going to be expansion of rent control. A lot of bad things didn't pass, mainly because of the opposition of CAR. So always, that's why you always pay your dues, and part of your dues money goes to political action. And it's always a good idea to give more money. The more money you give, the more power we have. So anyway, so that's the big picture. Now let's talk about the laws, maybe 10 laws that you might be interested in. The only one affecting your license directly is one that says, if you want to get a broker's license, you have to be an agent for 2 years first, right? New law says the 2 years of being an agent first has to be within the last 5 years. So if someone was an agent like 10 years ago for a few years and they dropped out of the business and now they want to come back and be a broker, nope. They still got to be an agent for 2 more years because they have to do 2 of the last 5. All right. Also, when you take your classes starting this year, when you renew your real estate license, you'll see you're still going to have 45 hours. It's going to be slightly different. There's going to be a new class on implicit bias, and the fair housing class has been increased, and it's going to have an interactive component to it. All right. Other laws you should know about. There are 2 new laws affecting rentals that did get passed. One of them creates something called a reusable tenant screening report. Let's say I'm a tenant and I'm looking for a place to live, and there are a few places I want to apply. Well, remember, the landlord can charge you a fee to screen you, and that can add up if you're applying at multiple places. So there's a new law that says an applicant tenant can go to a consumer reporting agency and get a tenant screening report, a tenant screening report that they can use for multiple applications. They can use the same report to apply at different landlords. I mean, it's a certified report, has all the information the landlord wants, income history, rental history, criminal record, all that stuff. And you can use it for a 30-day period at multiple applicants. The applicant would only pay 1 fee. Now, I must point out, landlords don't have to take this. Landlords can say, no, I'm not going to take your reusable tenant screening report. I'm going to screen you myself, and you got to pay me the $52. But hopefully some landlords will accept this because it's already going to be prepared. It's already ready. It's the same report they're going to get if they order it themselves, but it's already there. And the tenant's going to have to sign something saying, I swear that nothing has, this is, it's good for 30 days, and the tenant will sign something swearing that nothing has changed since it was produced. Okay. All right. The other law affecting rentals is, it affects domestic violence. Okay. Now, under the old law, if you had a tenant and they say to you, the landlord, I'm a victim of domestic violence, I want to leave this situation, the landlord has to allow the tenant out, even though they got, months left on their lease. If they can produce either a police report or some type of restraining order, you have to let them out of the lease. On the other hand, under the old law, the landlord would have the right to say, well, I just don't like domestic violence going on my properties. I'm just going to terminate the whole lease, whether the tenant wants to or not. New law says you can't do that to the tenant. You can't just kick them out just because there's domestic violence. You still got to let the victim out if they want. But the new thing is the victim can say to the landlord, I want to stay. I want you to evict the bad person I'm living with. And if they can produce a police report, restraining order, or some report from a qualified third party, such as some victim advocate group or something like that, some established group, the landlord is required to evict the bad person, the alleged bad person, and let the victim, the alleged victim, stay. And this applies even if the actual victim of domestic violence isn't the tenant, it's a family member who's living there. You still got to evict the person, the alleged perpetrator. Now, part of the eviction process is, and the landlord has to change the locks. But the rule also says, tenant, if you get the landlord to evict the bad person, if you, the tenant, allow the bad person to come back, that's grounds to evict you and terminate the whole tenancy. Also, for landlords, if the alleged bad person poses a threat to other tenants, in other words, they've been threatening everybody, you know, that kind of person sometimes. So there's a threat to not just the victim tenant, but to other neighbors. Under those circumstances, the landlord can terminate the entire tenancy, kick out everybody. One last thing. Let's say the person who's evicted is the person who's got the money paying the rent. Can the landlord require that the remaining tenant requalify? No, you got to let them stay. But of course, if they can't afford the rent, you'll find that out pretty quick. Like the next month when they can't pay the rent, then of course you can evict them for non-payment of rent. Okay, let me go to the Q&As. I think I have some questions. Okay, Nancy Medina, if ADU is not permitted, can rent be increased and how do evictions apply? Nancy, sounds like a pretty specific question there. It might depend on where you are. If your question is, can you increase the rent on the unpermitted ADU? No. But if that's not what you're asking, maybe you can, I want to give you my email address. You can email me more specifically. And Nancy, I have another question. Can credit reports be pulled every 2 years or during a period of time to make check tenants continue to be in good standing? Well, if they're still on a lease, if they qualified for the lease and they're on the lease and they're paying their rent, it doesn't matter what happens to their credit as long as they're paying the rent. But if the lease is over, right, then you can do whatever you want. You can requalify them or whatever, starting April 1st. Between now and March 31st, you cannot do anything to the tenant if they're paying the rent. You can't check their credit or anything like that. But once that's over and we're not in the city of LA, then you would be able to. Joanna, yeah, what if the victim doesn't work or cannot pay the rent? Like I just said, if they can't pay the rent, you can evict them for non-payment of rent. Bricia, Long Beach City, yeah, I don't keep up with the local eviction moratorium. If you call the legal hotline, I'm sure they can tell you. But we can look it up. But I just don't keep up at the top of my head. Rosie Garcia, can you increase the rent and the tenant doesn't want to sign the increased notice? What do? If there's no lease, they're month to month. You can increase the rent. If they don't pay, you evict them for non-payment of rent. But there are special rules. Remember what I said, depending on what city you're in and depending on what type of property it is and how old the property is. You can always increase someone's rent, but sometimes there are limits on how much. That's why, Rosie, we have a specific scenario. Email me later or call the legal hotline. David Gomez, how often can I raise the rent? As much as, well, it depends, once again, on the type of property it is. Certain properties that are exempt from rent control, you can increase it anytime you want. I mean, if you have a lease, obviously you can't increase it till the end of the lease. In certain places, you can only increase it once a year. Once again, these are all great questions. And my point is, call the legal hotline. Tell them where exactly your rental property is, how many units is it, how old is it, and that's going to determine the answer to your question. But Luis, bottom line is, if it's going to be, yes, outside of city of LA or Long Beach. I don't know if Long Beach has rent control. Outside of cities that have their own rent caps, you can always increase the rent by at least 10%. And starting tomorrow, in certain places, you can increase the rent by more than 10%. So if 10% is safe, if you do 10%, you're going to be okay, unless you're in a city with a rent cap like LA and maybe Long Beach, Santa Monica. You get what I'm saying? Okay. You know what? I'm just going to put the number of the hotline in the chat right now. How do you like that? And David Gomez, the landlord's a corporation. That doesn't affect it at all. Okay. All right. Going to the chat. I am going to put the legal hotline phone number. which hasn't changed for 45 years. And I'm going to put my email address. Problem with my email address is I don't get back to you as quick as the hotline does. I will get back to you eventually if you're patient. That's my email address. All right. I'm sorry, I'm not going to call on people raising your hand. Maybe at the end if we have time. Okay. And I believe, Veronica, the class is recorded, so I think you can watch it again. All right. We can come back to rentals if you want. Let's talk about some other things. Other laws you might be interested in. Interesting law about regarding accessory dwelling units. You know, everyone has the right to build an ADU. The HOA can't stop you. The city can't stop you. The county can't stop you as long as you meet the building code. But you still got to get an ADU permit. And they can limit you how tall the ADU can be. First change is new law says when you apply for an ADU permit, they have to approve it within 60 days, assuming you get a building permit, etc. Number two, you can build ADUs bigger than you used to. It used to be you were limited to 16 feet high. Now, if it's an ADU that's within a half a mile from a transit stop or a major traffic corridor, it can be 18 feet high. And also, if you need to align the roof angle of the ADU with the house, the main house, it can be 20 feet high. And if it's an ADU that's attached to the main property rather than detached, then it can be 25 feet high. So bottom line, it's easier. It should be quicker to build accessory dwelling units, and you can make them a little bigger. Another thing, if you're running into a problem with the city or the county or the HOA where you live, and they're not allowing you to do the accessory dwelling unit, call the hotline. We can help you. We have attorneys whose job is to make people allow you to build your ADUs. Okay, so just keep that in the back of your mind. Speaking of building, there's another new law that says if you have a house, let's say you got a 2-bedroom house, right? And you want to turn it into a 3-bedroom house or a 4-bedroom house. You're not going to add on to it. You just want to reconfigure the inside of the house. There's a new law that says you have an absolute right to do that. No hearing, no discretion. You get the building permit, you can do it. The city or county or HOA can't stop you arbitrarily from adding bedrooms in the inside of your house. You can add 1 or 2, not more than that, without their permission. Okay. Couple more things. Homeowner association. Does an HOA have to allow you to rent out your unit? The law says HOA has to allow at least 25% of the people who live in the association to rent out their unit. New law says, what if I only want to rent out a portion of my unit, not the whole thing, just a portion? The law says you have an absolute right to do that. That doesn't count towards the 25%. So if you're still going to live there yourself and you're just renting out a portion of it, the HOA has to allow it. They have no right to say no at all. If you want to rent out the whole thing and 25% or more of the association is already rentals, then they could say no. All right. All right. Let's talk about mobile home parks, something very simple. If any of you deal with mobile home parks, or if any of you run mobile home parks, new law says at least one person in the management of the mobile home park must become a certified mobile home park manager. They actually have to take a class, 8-hour class, and take a test and be certified that they know what they're doing when it comes to mobile home laws and rentals and sales and moving the mobile home. They got to know all that stuff, and they got to renew it every 2 years, et cetera, et cetera. REOs, there's an interesting new law. So let's say you're a bank and you foreclose on property, and then you want to sell it as an REO, right? There's a new law that says for the big banks, the big mortgage servicers, the entities that foreclose on at least 175 properties a year, those REO entities. When they start to sell off the properties they foreclosed on, number one, they can only sell them one at a time. They used to be able to say, okay, we're going to sell 10 properties at once. Well, who can buy 10 properties at once? Only a big institutional investor. But if they sell it one by one, that means anyone can buy it and maybe live in it themselves. The law also says that when they put the REO on the market, for the first 30 days that it's on the market, the seller can only accept offers from people who swear that they're going to occupy the property as their residence. So they have to give favoritism for a month to owner occupiers and certain nonprofits. Okay. So that's an interesting one. Let's see, is there anything else I really think you should know about as far as new laws? To tell you the truth, that's about it. As you can see, there's nothing too crazy going on. There was a lot of crazy stuff that didn't get passed, but thankfully, none of the really crazy stuff passed. The domestic violence one is kind of controversial. So I would recommend to you, if you're a landlord and you do get this situation where the tenant says, domestic violence, I want you to evict this person or this person. Once again, call a lawyer, call us before you do anything, because it's a little bit complicated. Okay. By the way, if you want to get all of this stuff in writing, first of all, we have a handout on our website, 2023 New Laws Affecting Real Estate, which summarizes everything I just said and a few more. You look on the risk management section of car.org. If you can't find it, call the hotline. We'll send it to you. Email me, I'll send it to you. Okay? So it explains in detail. And if you have any questions on anything I just said, of course, the hotline attorneys can deal with you. Elba, thanks for telling us that Bell Gardens has rent control. I don't keep track of it anymore. Anonymous has asked me, any new laws applying to foreclosures or notice of defaults or short sales? No. Veronica, can I create educational video? Sure you can. Obviously, you can always create your own videos. All right. Now let's talk about new forms, okay? There's a few new forms and a couple changes to the forms you've already got. Now I'm going to share my screen. Wait, hold on. I got to do something else. Wait, back to the Q&A. San Bernardino, Rosie, I don't think has rent control. Alex, is a homeowner eligible to purchase a primary residence at the auction using traditional finance? At what type of auction? Like the like a probate auction? Or usually you have to make sure you have all cash or a certain amount in cash. Once again, call the hotline or email me for more details. David, in a rent control area, can you increase the rent? Yes. But it depends on what city you're in, how much you can increase it by. If you're in property that's 15 years or older, 3 or more units, you can only increase it 10%. If it's single family, owner occupied, duplex, or newer house, starting tomorrow, you can increase it. Starting Friday, you can increase it as much as you want, unless you're in certain cities. Trustee sale, Alex, I now understand what you're talking about. I mean, yeah, there's no, you can use traditional finance is the big pick, is the general answer. All right. Hold on a second, guys. We got to talk about forms. I know you want to know about the forms. The forms are important. Let's see here. Let me find them. All right. Okay, we're all going to be looking at the purchase contract first. So first, I'm going to talk about what's changed in the purchase contract, okay? The answer is not much. but a couple of important things. First thing, you know, on the very first page, paragraph 3, when it has the terms, you put down the loan amount, what the buyer is willing to pay, interest rate not to exceed. It used to say buyer to pay 0 points. Now, buyer can say, no, I'm willing to pay, 1 point, 2 point, whatever. If they're not willing to pay any points, they could put 0. Okay, but now it used to just say 0 points. Remember, this is where you tell the seller, okay, my offer is contingent on getting a loan. And I'm looking for a loan not to exceed whatever, 5%. And I'm looking for a loan not to exceed 1 point or 0 points or whatever. So you're telling the seller what you're willing to do, because you have to make a good faith effort to get this loan. And if you do apply, if the lender approves the loan you said you wanted, you can't use the loan contingency to cancel the deal. Second change is very important. A lot of people have noticed it. I want to tell you it's not a big deal at all. See this new thing here on the second page, paragraph 3G3? There's this new box where it says seller agrees to pay the obligation of buyer to compensate buyer's broker under a separate agreement. Seller's broker offer, if any, to compensate buyer's broker is unaffected. What the heck does that mean? You're never going to use this unless you have a buyer broker contract. Most of you, I bet, never use buyer broker contracts. What is a buyer broker contract? That's when you sign a contract with the buyer you're working with. And they agree something like, if you help them buy something in the next 60 days, they guarantee you get paid whatever, 2.5%, let's say. But even if you have a buyer broker contract that says that, usually the buyer still doesn't have to pay, because usually when you're working with a buyer, even if you have a buyer broker contract, you end up writing an offer on a listing in the MLS. And the MLS listing, the listing agent is offering you like 2.5%, 3%. So if you have a buyer broker contract where your buyer has agreed to pay you 2.5%, but then you write up an offer for them on a listing in the MLS where the listing agent's offering you 2.5%, the buyer doesn't have to pay anything, because any amount the agent gets from another source is credited against the amount they owe under the buyer broker contract. The only time this is going to be relevant is, number one, you have a buyer broker contract, which most of you don't do. And number two, based on the buyer broker contract, the buyer actually owes you money. For example, let's say you have a buyer broker contract which says buyer agrees to pay buyer's broker 3%. And then you write up an offer on an MLS listing, and the listing agent is offering 2.5%. Well, the buyer promised you get 3%, but the MLS is only giving you 2.5%. So that means the buyer owes you 0.5%. The difference between what you agreed to in the buyer broker contract and what was in the MLS. In that rare situation, the buyer now has the option to ask the seller, not the listing agent, to ask the seller to pay that difference. So by checking this box, you're saying, seller, you're going to pay the obligation that the buyer has to compensate the buyer, to compensate their broker under a buyer broker contract. And this form SPBB, that's the form that tells the seller how much you're asking for, 0.5%, 1%, whatever. So bottom line, if you're a buyer's agent, most of you are never, ever going to check this box. Only if you have a buyer broker contract. And even if you have a buyer broker contract, the buyer usually doesn't owe you money. And even if they do owe you money, but that doesn't mean the buyer has to ask the seller to pay. They just can if they want to. And of course, if you ask the seller, they can always say no. It's just like you're asking the seller to pay for a termite report. You're asking for a credit to pay for whatever. They're asking you to pay for your transaction coordinator fee, which, by the way, you can ask them on this form to ask them to pay for your transaction coordinator fee if you want. What if you're the listing agent and you get an offer from a buyer and they check that box? And you say, okay, well, show me your buyer broker contract so I can show me how much you actually are, owe your buyer that you're asking me to pay. And they say, oh no, we don't have a buyer broker contract. Then you say, why did you check the box? And they're all confused. We're hearing a lot of this, where listing agents are getting offers from buyer's agents when they check this box, even though the buyer's agent doesn't have a buyer broker contract. What do you do in that case? Just counter it out. Just counter that, no, we're not going to do whatever you asked us to do. They actually don't even know what they're asking for, but that's a different question. Okay? So I want to point out to you, some people say, oh, I heard that buyer broker contracts are mandatory now. No, they're not. There are lawsuits going on nationwide where lawsuits are being filed against NAR, claiming that the whole commission structure in organized real estate violates the antitrust laws. In other words, how do commissions work now? Typically, seller pays listing agent, then the listing agent pays buyer's agent. And these lawsuits are saying, oh no, that's wrong. Buyers should be paying their own agent directly, and sellers should be paying their agent directly. None of this MLS cooperation stuff. These are lawsuits. Who knows who's going to win? It's going to take a long time. My prediction is if they go to trial, it'll be next year. Then it'll be appealed. It'll probably go on for 5 or 6 more years before there's ever an answer. And there's no guarantee that anything will change at all. Nothing may ever change. Buyer broker contracts may never be required. And they're certainly not required today. But if you do have a buyer broker contract and the buyer actually owes you money under that contract, you now have a way to ask the seller to pay for that if you want to. Okay? Next change is here on paragraph 3M. So let's say you're buying a house, right? And you tell, and right up on this 7E3 says you're buying it as a primary residence or a second home. Unless the buyer checks this box, if they don't check any box or they check this box, they're telling the seller they probably want to move in. They want the property to be vacant. So the next question is, I'm sorry, the question is dealing with the situation, when does the property have to be vacant, right? That's the question. So we go down to 3M, and there's 3 possibilities, right? The property is occupied by the seller, it's vacant, or it's occupied by other people. So if you're buying a house that's seller occupied or vacant, we're assuming you get to move in on the COE, close of escrow date. However, you can give the seller the opportunity to rent back. You can negotiate a rent back. If it's 29 days or less, you use this form. If it's 30 days or more, you use the RLAS form. But what if you're buying a property that's not occupied by the seller, but it's occupied by other people, like the tenant? By the way, who might be in the property who's not a tenant? You know, when a seller says we're going to vacate, that means they have to take their minor children with them. But what if the seller has their children over 18 living at home? Well, they're not tenants, they're not paying rent, and they're not sellers, they're not on title, and they're not minor children, so the seller doesn't have to take them with them. So if you're buying a house and the seller has their adult children there, you want everybody to leave. You don't just want the sellers on title, you want everybody. But all this says is this, if it's seller occupied. So if there's other people living there, like tenants or adult children, where does it say when they have to leave? It doesn't say. That's why you need this addendum, tenant occupied property addendum. So the buyer would submit that. On that form, they would say, okay, I want the tenants out a week before close or whatever. Okay, I want the adult children out on the closing day, whatever. See, there's no place to write it in the form, so you need to use this addendum. But a lot of times, though, the tenant doesn't know who's on the property. Maybe they just assume that the only people living there are the sellers. So here's the new thing over here. Seller, you must disclose to the buyer if there's anybody living there other than the seller, whether they're tenants, adult children, your friend who's not paying rent, your sister. Seller, you have to tell the buyer this. So the seller, if the buyer doesn't attach a TOPA, seller, you need to attach a TOPA in a counteroffer. And by the way, you know what else is good about the TOPA? It talks about what are the buyer's remedies if the property is not vacant. Think about that for a second. What if the contract says property to be vacant? The buyer's getting ready to close and they realize it's not vacant. What are the buyer's rights? Do they have the right to cancel the whole deal and get their money back? Do they have the right to hold back money from the seller until it is vacant? Do they have the right to delay closing until it's vacant? Or do they have to buy it anyway and deal with the tenant themselves? The answer is on this form. Nowhere else in the contract does it talk about what are the buyer's rights if the property is still occupied at the closing day. So I strongly recommend this form. Now, I do have good news for you, though. Let's say for some reason the buyer and seller still don't do that form. Fortunately, there's a new paragraph 7A, which basically says if the buyer intends to occupy the property as their primary residence, and unless you did a TOPA, everyone agrees that the unit the buyer intends to occupy shall be vacant. By the way, this also reminds you, let's say you're buying a duplex. You need to tell the seller which one you want to live in, or maybe you tell the seller, I want them both to be vacant. You have to deal with that. That's another reason you sort of need to use the TOPA form. Some people are going to say, well, now that it says the unit will be vacant, or if it's a single family home, the whole house will be vacant, I'm just going to rely on this. I don't need the TOPA form. I think you still need the TOPA form because that still deals with the issue of what are the buyer's rights if the property is not vacant. So it says right here, just like it said back in paragraph 3, seller shall disclose to buyer if occupied by tenants or person other than seller and attach the TOPA in a counteroffer. So try to get your sellers to do that. But even if they don't do it, at least there's a default here that basically says it's got to be vacant. Okay? All right. Let me go to questions. You guys really have a lot of questions on rentals. Everybody does. Brianna, if you inherited a property and rents are way below renter, can you increase the rent to bring it up to date? You're telling me city of Los Angeles, which means you're not going to be able to increase it as much as you want. Call the hotline and they can tell you exactly how much you can do it. If you weren't in city of LA, I'd say yes. City of LA, it depends on what year the property was built. Okay. So Luis Sanchez, I heard big banks will continue to buy houses many as 3,000 at a time. I mean, you're right. There's nothing really to prevent the highest bidder from increasing the offers. What I said, remember the only change is if it's a foreclosure, if it's an REO, they have to offer it first to owner occupiers, but that doesn't limit. They could still wait a month and then sell it to other people who's going to offer more money. Okay. Also, Luis, can a seller just discriminate against an investor or bank from buying the seller occupied property? Actually, yes, you can. That's a very good question. If the seller individually says, for some reason, I only want to sell to people who are going to live there, you can do that. In other words, you are allowed to discriminate against investors. You're allowed to do that. You can't discriminate against many people in California, but you can discriminate against people who don't plan on living at the property. By the way, have you noticed this on paragraph 8B3? There's this new, this happened about July, I think last July. There's a new form, there's a new attachment to the purchase contract, the Fair Appraisal Act addendum. You know, there are 7 forms attached to the purchase contract, right? And let's go back to when you pull up the form on Zip Form, you get this agency form, you get the fair housing form, you get the possible representation form, you get the wire fraud form, And at the end of the contract, you get 3 more forms, right? You get the buyer inspection advisory. Then you get the Fair Appraisal Act addendum. Out of all these forms I just showed you, this is the only one that's an addendum, not an advisory. You know what that means? It must be signed by buyer and seller. The other forms are really designed for the buyer's agent to give advice to the buyer. So you want the buyer to sign, you don't care if the seller signs. And even if the buyer doesn't sign it, it doesn't affect the contract. They still got it, no big deal. But this one attachment, the Fair Appraisal Act addendum, since it's the magic word addendum, that means buyer and seller must sign it. Then the last one is the privacy form. Once again, you'd like them to sign it. It doesn't kill the deal if they don't sign it. But if they don't sign the Fair Appraisal Act addendum, that kills the deal. You don't have a binding contract. All right. Okay. Back to the contract. Any other changes we should know about? Couple more, not much. We're almost done with the purchase contract. There is a new disclosure in paragraph 11M. Remember, M is the disclosure paragraph. So it has all the mandatory disclosures. There's a new one that just came out a couple months ago called solar systems. So if you're a seller and your house has solar panels or solar systems, whether you own it or leasing it, you need to fill out this new form, the SOLAR, answer the questions to the best of your knowledge. It talks about, whether it's leased or owned, and how much time is left on the lease, and what's the monthly payment, and what type of solar system it is. Sometimes the seller's not even going to know the answer to these questions, but they should know basically what their lease payment is. Bottom line is, next time you take a listing on a property with solar panels or any solar system, make sure the seller fills out this form. Okay? By the way, remember I said there are 10 new forms? Okay. So this is one new form, and it's a mandatory form. It's the only new form that's a mandatory form, and it's only mandatory when you have solar panels or solar system on your listing. Okay. Other new form, there's a form called the non-contingent offer advisory. Sometimes, not in this market, but a few months ago, sometimes people would make non-contingent offers, but they really didn't know what they were doing when they did that, and they end up blaming their agent for letting them do that. So if the market ever changes and gets crazy again, where buyers are actually making non-contingent offers, we have a new form called the non-contingent offer advisory, which you can give, which I recommend buyer's agent gives to the buyer. It's certainly not required, and it's certainly, you're never going to use it probably in this market today, right? It's not something that's going to come up very often today. Getting back to the purchase contracts, we got one form you're going to use, the solar form. You got another form you're not going to use in this market, the non-contingent offer advisory. Is there anything else new in the purchase contract? 3 more things. One thing, did you know that when you sell a house, paragraph 9 tells you what's included in the sale, right? What in the house is included? And the answer is, it talks about paragraph 9, all the things that are included. And one of the things that's included are window coverings. It used to just say window coverings, and then people used to ask, does that include the shutters and the blinds? So yes. Now it specifically says window coverings include blinds, curtains, drapes, shutters, etc. But you know what people still ask? People say, well, the curtains are included. What about the curtain rods? I mean, I always assumed that if the curtains are included, the curtain rods are included, but apparently that wasn't clear enough. So they just added these words right here. And any associated hardware and rods. So yes, in case you didn't know it already, curtain rods come with the house. They're part of the house. Because believe it or not, some people would argue that. All right, two more things. You know how when you have deadlines in this contract, let's say you got 17 days to remove contingencies, you got 7 days to deliver the disclosures, you got 45 days to close, right? And you're trying to figure out what is the deadline day. So remember, the day of acceptance is day 0. And then you count every day. You count Saturday, Sunday, Christmas, New Year, you count every single day. But if the 17th day or the 7th day, or if you're giving a notice to perform the 2nd day, demand to close escrow the 3rd day, the closing day, the 45th day, if the last day falls on a Saturday, Sunday, or legal holiday, then the deadline is not that day. The deadline is the next following day that's not a Saturday, Sunday, or legal holiday. So the question is, everybody used to know what the legal holidays were, but California keeps adding legal holidays. They just added 3 more this year. So how do I know if all of these new holidays are legal holidays for purposes of this contract? So what's been added to the contract is legal holiday means any holiday or optional bank holiday under Civil Code 7.1 and any holiday under Government Code 6700. So you really actually have to Google. If you look at your calendar and you have a deadline that falls on, let's say, St. Patrick's Day or Halloween or June 19th or Cesar Chavez Day, and you're wondering, is that a legal holiday for purposes of this contract? You actually have to Google this code section and these code sections. I know what you're thinking. Why don't you just list them in the contract? Because they keep adding new ones. We don't want to keep changing the contract. By the way, unfortunately, Halloween and St. Patrick's Day are not legal holidays. Isn't that sad? The best holidays don't even count. Okay, anyway, so check that out. And the very last thing I want to tell you is on the last page of the contract, what we call the broker box. Page 16. Up until 2 months ago, you just put your broker's name, license number, your name, your license number. There was no address, email, phone number, whatever. Now there's address, email, so it auto-populates with your address and your email. What's the significance of that? Well, remember, up until 2 months ago, there was a line right here where the agent would put in their designated electronic delivery address. You're basically telling the other agent, if you want to email me any documents, if you're going to send over the TDS, you're going to send a request for repair, you're going to send a contingency removal, if you're going to send anything via email, here's the email address I want you to send it to. But now you don't have to type in your email address anymore. All you have to do is, it's going to auto-populate with your email address. All you have to do is check the box. If you check this box, you're saying to the other agent, yes, this is the email to send stuff to. But maybe you'd rather they send stuff to a different email, maybe your assistant transaction coordinator's email address. Well, in that case, you would check this box and type in the other email address. But if you want all emails sent to your regular email address, this is going to sort of auto-populate and you just have to check the box. What if none of these boxes are checked? Well, then the agent is telling you, no, I don't have a designated email address. So they're telling you they're the kind of agent's going to play games with you. You're going to send them an email. They're going to say, oh, you didn't send it to the right place, or I never got it, or whatever. So if this happens, if the other agent doesn't check any of these boxes, if I were you, I'd call them up and say, hey, you got to give me an email address here. I'm not going to hand deliver everything. And we actually have a form to give them if they forgot to check any of these boxes. It's called the Designated Electronic Delivery Address Addendum. If they check the box, you don't need it. So both agents are going to check, or should be doing this. Okay. So that's 3 new forms, by the way. The non-contingent offer advisor, you're never going to use in this market because you're not going to make non-contingent offers. We got the solar form, and we got the designated electronic delivery address form that this is really between the agents. If the other agent doesn't give you an email address, You don't have to counter it out. You can just send them the form. Hey, you forgot to give me your email address. I need your email address. And that's what that form is for, the DEDA. All right. So remember I told you those are 10, they're 10 forms. So what are the other 7 forms that are new? All right. That's the next topic. I'm not going to share the screen for this because most of these forms that I'm about to tell you about, you're not going to use. One of them only deals with property management. If any of you guys are property managers, and maybe your client, the landlord, says, hey, find me a tenant. And when you find the tenant, prepare the lease and get them to sign it. Okay. Have you ever looked at the CAR lease form? There are a lot of blanks there that need to be filled in, like disclosures, like this, the landlord has to disclose, do we have a bed bug issue? Do we have regular termite reports? Did anyone die here in the last 3 years? Is it pre-78? Possibility of lead-based paint? Was there ever methamphetamine use on the property? So these are blanks that the seller has to fill in. I'm sorry, that the landlord has to fill in. But of course, if you're the agent and your client wants you to fill it out for them, you don't know if somebody died in the last 3 years. You don't know if there's bed bugs. You don't know if there's ever been meth use. So you have to ask your client these questions so you can fill in the blanks on the lease for your client. The point is we have a new form to facilitate this. It's called the rental property owner disclosure. So if I was an agent acting as a property manager, I would give this form to my client, the owner, the landlord, and say, please answer these questions so I can prepare the lease on your behalf. It's also a good form because it reminds the landlord of things like, remember, if the house is pre-84, you have to make sure it has low flow plumbing. It reminds them if they should think about who's responsible for cutting the grass, if it's something like that. And are there special rules for the laundry room? Whatever. It reminds the owner of things they should be talking about to the tenant. And it also gives all the information to the property manager so they can properly fill out the lease. Is this form required by law? No. Should I give this form to the tenant? No. This is a form you give to your client, the landlord. They fill it out, give it back to you, and then you use that to fill out the lease for your client on the landlord's side. Okay? So that's 4 forms. Laura Sandez, do we still need 2 forms of delivery for confirmation of delivery? No. Good question. If the other agent fills in on the contract, right, their designated electronic delivery address, if they fill that in, the contract says, and this is very important, the contract says that if I send you an email, right, if I send you an email, I'll pull this back up. So if I send you an email to the address you gave me, that's all the proof I have to have. In other words, if I can prove that I sent it, I don't have to prove that you received it. That's the beauty of this designated electronic delivery address. If you have a designated electronic delivery address, you're telling the other agent, send it to me. As soon as you press send, it is considered to be delivered. Okay? All right. Now, let's wrap this up. I said there's 6 more forms, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these forms because these 6 other forms all have to do with buyer brokerage, which most of you don't do, and you may never have to do it, but one day it's possible. It's possible 2 or 3 years from now, the law might change, and all buyers to represent all buyers agents to represent a buyer are going to have a buyer broker contract. That's not the case today. But if you do have a buyer broker contract, what are the 6 new forms? One of them is we have a new buyer broker contract. We used to have 3. One was like an exclusive listing, which says buyer is telling you if I buy anything in the next 60 days or whatever, you get paid. Then we had a non-exclusive one that said, if I buy anything through your efforts, then I'll pay you. And the third one didn't involve money at all. It just said, I'm your agent, you're my buyer, we're working together. So those three have been combined into one form called the Buyer Representation and Broker Compensation Agreement, BRBC. And it's basically a non-exclusive one. It basically says, if you buy a house through my efforts in the next so many days, I get paid. Now, if you want to make it exclusive, so if they buy anything, no matter who helps them, you can check the box to make it exclusive. But if you don't want to commit them to money, when it comes to the compensation part, you just put 0. So 3 forms. Now, if you use the buyer broker contract, there's also a cancellation form. One of the changes to the form is either the buyer or the buyer's broker can cancel the deal anytime they want. So we have a form, cancellation of buyer representation. Because sometimes buyers don't want to sign a buyer broker contract because they don't want to be committed to you indefinitely. So now you tell them, hey, you can cancel anytime you want. But if it is canceled, and before it's canceled, you have shown them certain properties, if they end up buying one of those properties and after this is canceled, you still get paid. So it protects you. So obviously, if it does get canceled or it terminates, you need to give a list to your client as the buyer's broker as to what properties you showed them or introduced them to. So we have a form called the Notice of Broker Involved Properties. So we got the combined buyer broker contract, the cancellation of buyer representation, the list of broker involved properties. That's 3 forms. We also just have a generic buyer transactional advisory, which is basically is a 1-page form. It advises that when you're working with an agent, what are the buyer's obligations? What are the agent's duties? It's actually not a bad form to give, even if you don't have a written buyer broker contract. It's called the BTA, Buyer Transactional Advisory. And there's 2 more forms. Getting back to the that thing on the purchase contract, let me share one more time. Remember I talked about that thing in paragraph 3 that nobody's going to use unless you have a buyer broker contract, but you have the right to ask the seller to pay the money that you owe your agent. 3G3. Well, if you're going to use this, you need to tell the agent, tell your client how much, tell the seller how much you're asking them to pay. And that's when you're going to use this form, the seller payment to buyer broker. So that's the 5th new form. The last new form, and all of these are related to buyer brokerage. So if you don't use buyer broker forms, you're not going to use these forms, is called the ABCD, Anticipated Broker Compensation Disclosure. Let me ask you something. When you don't have to answer, I'm just asking you rhetorically. When you're working with a buyer, do you normally tell your buyer how much money you're getting paid? And the answer is no, I know you don't. Should you? In my opinion, yes, but no agent has ever gotten in trouble for not telling their buyer how much they're getting paid. So at this point in time, it's not required by law. It might be required by law when these new things happen. There may be a new law that says you have to tell your client how much you're getting paid if they buy this house or this house or this house. If you have a buyer broker contract, actually it's required right now, right? Doesn't that make sense? I mean, if you have a buyer broker contract and the buyers has guaranteed you 2.5%, and you want to look at 3 houses. On one of them, the buyer owes, the MLS is offering 2%, which means the buyer's going to have to pay you 1/2. The other 2, the listing agent's offering you 2.5 or 3, which means the buyer's not going to have to pay anything. So if you have a buyer broker contract where the buyer is promising to pay you the difference between what the MLS is offering and what they're offering, obviously you have to tell them before they write the offer how much the MLS is offering the buyer's agent. So you have to tell them we got a form for this. It's called the ABCD Anticipated Broker Compensation Disclosure. Now, the buyer can figure this out anyway. The commission being offered to the buyer's agent is now listed in the MLS on the public part. So if they go to the trouble of looking, they can see that. But even though they can see that, if you have a buyer broker contract, you should still provide this form. What if you don't have a buyer broker contract? This form is not required. You can do it if you want to, but you don't have to. But of course, the law might change in a couple years, in which case the forms are ready. All right. All right. That is the end of my time here. I don't see any more questions in the Q&A. I don't see anything in chat. If anyone wants to unmute yourself and just talk to me for a minute, a couple of you wanted to do that before. If they have the ability, Ark, I don't know.
Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and allow everyone to talk.
Before I get to that, Luis has a question. If you have a buyer broker form and you show the buyer house, but decides to buy the house in front, not participating in MLS, and the broker represent them, yeah, the buyer's obligated to pay you. Absolutely. All right, does anyone want to raise their hands? You can do so. Joanna, yes, go ahead.
Yes, thank you so much. This is something a little random, but for record keeping, I know that we traditionally have to print out all of our documents and forms and keep a hard file for 3 years. Can we just keep a computer-based file instead of printing everything out now?
Yes, glad you asked the question. They changed the rules. You can keep it. You do not have to print everything out.
And we still have to keep for 3 years.
Correct.
Thank you.
And sometimes it's a good idea to keep it longer. I will say if they're good records, keep them longer. If they're bad records, destroy them at the 3-year mark. But sometimes they help you even beyond that. Yes, good question. Anybody else? I don't see anybody. So I'm gonna.
Rizzler has a question. Maria,
I'm
you
sorry.
can unmute yourself.
Go ahead, whoever wants to talk. Well, you all have my email and you all have the legal hotline. This is recorded. I think you can listen to it again. And we have on our website a summary of the new laws, which we can send to you if you want. We also have a summary of these forms that I was talking about. We also did webinars on these forms. We did a 1-hour webinar just on the purchase contract changes. We did a 1-hour webinar just on the buyer broker forms, and we did a 1-hour webinar just on the property management stuff. Those are also, you can look at anytime you want. You go to the CAR website, car.org, and look up legal live webinars. And if you can't find them, call the hotline or email me. Not seeing any other questions.
Yeah, it doesn't look like no questions in the Q&A or the chat. So.
Oh, Alex got a question into chat. Monterey Park, as far as I know, there's no limit. There's no rent control in Monterey Park. So yes,